On the Eastern Front in 1943, armored combat had evolved into a form of warfare defined by seconds, mechanical reliability, and decisions made at distances measured not in kilometers, but in meters. Tank engagements in the open steppe could occur at long range, with crews trading fire across hundreds of meters while maneuvering for advantage. But in the villages, forests, and broken terrain that increasingly defined the battlefield after the German advance stalled, encounters were often sudden, violent, and extremely close. At such distances, armor thickness, gun caliber, and tactical doctrine mattered less than reaction time and mechanical reliability. A single failure at the wrong moment could turn a technically superior vehicle into a stationary target. By the summer following the failure of the German offensive at Kursk, the strategic situation had shifted. German armored units were no longer advancing in broad operational sweeps. Instead, they were fighting defensive actions, counterattacks, and local engagements designed to slow Soviet momentum. Many German tank formations were under strength, their equipment worn by months of continuous operations, maintenance difficulties, and increasingly strained supply lines. Replacement vehicles arrived slowly. Spare parts were often unavailable. Crews were expected to keep aging machines operational under field conditions that offered little margin for error. In one such engagement, a Panzer IV commanded by a German officer found itself operating as part of a small defensive element tasked with holding a road junction near a partially destroyed village. The terrain limited visibility. Rubble shell craters and scattered buildings created narrow fields of fire and multiple blind approaches. German doctrine emphasized long-range gunnery whenever possible, but the environment made that impossible. Soviet armored units advancing through the area were using the terrain deliberately, moving from cover to cover and closing the distance before exposing themselves. The Panzer IV was not the most heavily armored tank on the battlefield by this stage of the war, but it remained one of the Wehrmacht's most reliable and widely used vehicles. Equipped with the long-barreled 7mm K40 gun, it was capable of destroying most Soviet medium tanks at moderate range if it achieved the first accurate shot. Its effectiveness, however, depended entirely on the functioning of its main armament. Unlike infantry, a tank crew had few options if its primary weapon failed in combat. Late in the afternoon, as Soviet pressure increased along the sector, the German commander positioned his vehicle behind the corner of a collapsed masonry structure, using the remaining wall as partial cover. The intent was to engage targets appearing along a narrow street that led toward the junction. Visibility was limited to less than 100 meters. The crew operated under conditions of constant noise. Distant artillery, the rumble of engines, and the irregular crack of small arms fire in the surrounding area. The first indication of Soviet armor came not from sight but from sound. The distinct mechanical rhythm of a diesel engine grew louder from beyond the rubble line. The commander raised himself slightly within the open hatch to improve visibility, aware that doing so increased his exposure to small arms fire but accepting the risk. Seconds later, the nose of a T-34 appeared between two shattered buildings, moving cautiously but steadily forward. The distance between the two vehicles at the moment of visual contact was approximately 30 meters. At such range, neither armor protection nor advanced optics provided a meaningful advantage. If the German gun fired first and struck effectively, the Soviet tank would likely be destroyed immediately. If the Soviet crew reacted faster, the outcome would be reversed just as quickly. There was no room for maneuver. The street was too narrow, the debris too heavy, and the engagement too sudden. Inside the Panzer IV, the gunner had already aligned the sight. The loader rammed a high-explosive anti-tank round into the breech. The commander gave the order to fire. The gun did not discharge. For a fraction of a second, the crew assumed the problem was a miscommunication or a delay in the firing mechanism. The gunner attempted to fire again. Nothing happened. The loader reported that the round was seated correctly. The breech appeared closed. The electrical firing circuit, however, had failed. Whether the fault was caused by vibration, wear, or a damaged contact was impossible to determine in the moment. What mattered was that the primary weapon of the tank was now inoperative at a distance where reaction time was measured in seconds. The Soviet tank had not yet fired. Its commander, likely surprised by the sudden appearance of the German vehicle at such close range, was still orienting his turret. The brief hesitation on the Soviet side provided a narrow window of opportunity, but the German commander understood immediately that the tactical situation had changed completely. His tank no longer possessed the capability it had been positioned to use. Remaining stationary meant waiting for the Soviet crew to complete their aim. Standard procedure in the event of a main gun malfunction was to attempt immediate correction. The Panzer IV's firing system allowed for a manual backup using a mechanical trigger mechanism if the electrical system failed. But accessing and activating this backup required seconds the crew might not have. The commander had to decide whether to attempt a rapid repair, order the driver to reverse out of sight, or take an action not covered by standard engagement procedures. Reversing was not a reliable option. The rubble behind the tank limited movement, and turning within the confined space would expose the vehicle's thinner side armor. Attempting to withdraw slowly would give the Soviet crew time to fire. Attempting to repair the firing system while stationary carried the same risk. Every second spent inside the kill zone increased the likelihood of destruction. The commander chose a different course of action. Instead of withdrawing, he ordered the driver to move forward. The decision ran counter to instinct and doctrine. Closing the distance further would eliminate any remaining reaction time and bring the vehicles into direct contact range. But the commander was operating under a specific calculation. At extremely close distance, the Soviet gun's ability to depress sufficiently for an accurate shot could be limited. More importantly, physical proximity could disrupt the enemy's ability to stabilize and fire effectively. The Panzer IV surged forward, accelerating directly toward the T-34. The Soviet crew, already in the process of aligning their gun, now faced a rapidly changing target distance. At under 20 meters, the engagement ceased to resemble a conventional tank duel. Visibility through optics became less useful than direct observation. The German driver aimed the hull toward the Soviet tank's front quarter, attempting to spoil its firing angle. The two vehicles collided. The impact was not catastrophic, but it was violent enough to jolt both crews and momentarily disrupt turret alignment. The German commander immediately ordered the hull machine gun to fire, directing bursts toward the Soviet vision slits and exposed areas around the turret ring. The intent was not to penetrate armor, which the machine gun could not do, but to suppress the Soviet crew's observation and slow their reaction. Inside the German turret, the loader worked frantically to switch the firing system to manual operation. The gunner maintained alignment as best he could despite the close contact and the shifting position of the vehicles. The mechanical backup required deliberate action, and the confined space magnified the difficulty. At this distance, the outcome depended entirely on which crew restored effective fire first. The Soviet tank attempted to reverse, its engine revving sharply as the driver tried to create space for the main gun. The German driver responded by maintaining pressure, maneuvering to keep the hull angled against the Soviet front and preventing a clear firing position. The engagement had devolved into a contest of coordination rather than firepower. Seconds later, the German gunner reported that the manual firing mechanism was ready. The commander gave the order. At less than 15 meters, the Panzer IV's main gun finally discharged. The result was immediate. At that distance, armor penetration was virtually guaranteed. The round struck the T-34's frontal area near the turret ring, an area already under stress from the collision. The impact disabled the Soviet tank's fighting capability, ending the engagement within seconds. The German vehicle remained operational but shaken. The commander ordered an immediate repositioning away from the street, aware that additional Soviet armor might be approaching. Only after reaching cover did the crew assess the damage to their own systems and confirm that the electrical firing circuit remained unreliable. The decision to close the distance rather than withdraw was later analyzed within the unit not as an act of aggression, but as a response to mechanical failure under extreme conditions. At 30 meters, the failure of the main gun had eliminated the advantage of positioning. The commander had recognized that remaining stationary would convert his vehicle into a target. Movement, even movement toward the enemy, restored initiative. The engagement illustrates a central reality of armored warfare on the Eastern Front. Technical specifications and armor thickness mattered less than the ability of crews to react to unexpected failures. Tanks were complex machines operating in environments that accelerated wear and increased the likelihood of malfunction. Combat decisions were often shaped not by doctrine alone, but by the condition of equipment at the moment of contact. At 30 meters, with a jammed gun and seconds to act, the German commander did not follow procedure. He followed probability. What followed after the engagement, the condition of the vehicle, the response of Soviet forces in the area, and the broader operational context in which such close-range encounters became increasingly common, would reveal how often survival in armored warfare depended not on superior machines, but on decisions made when those machines failed. Once the immediate danger had passed and the damaged Soviet tank was no longer a threat, the German crew's situation remained far from secure. Close-range engagements in built-up terrain rarely occurred in isolation. Soviet armored units operating in the sector moved in groups, often supported by infantry advancing through adjacent buildings and debris fields. The collision and gunfire would have revealed the Panzer IV's position to any nearby forces. The commander's first priority was not confirming the destruction of the enemy vehicle, but restoring mobility and reducing exposure. The driver reversed carefully, easing the tank back behind the partial cover of the collapsed structure where the engagement had begun. The maneuver was slow. The impact with the T-34 had bent one of the Panzer's external fenders and partially jammed debris into the right track guard. Any abrupt movement risked throwing the track entirely, which would immobilize the vehicle at a moment when mobility was the only reliable protection. Once the hull was masked by masonry and rubble, the commander ordered the engine kept at low power while the crew conducted a rapid internal assessment. The primary concern was the main gun's reliability. The electrical firing circuit remained intermittent, and the loader confirmed that the manual trigger could be used only with deliberate preparation. In practical terms, the tank could no longer guarantee immediate first-shot capability. On a battlefield where survival often depended on firing first within seconds of contact, this represented a critical degradation. The commander reported the malfunction by radio, but communications across the sector were fragmented. Static, overlapping transmissions, and the movement of units made it unlikely that maintenance assistance would arrive quickly, if at all. Mechanical failure under combat conditions was not unusual by this stage of the war. German armored units in 1943 were operating equipment that had been pushed far beyond peacetime maintenance cycles. Dust, vibration, extreme temperatures, and shock from near misses all contributed to electrical faults and mechanical wear. Replacement parts were scarce, and field repairs often relied on improvisation. Tank crews were expected to function not only as operators but as mechanics capable of restoring critical systems between engagements. While the gunner and loader inspected the firing contacts and wiring accessible within the turret, the commander observed the street through his periscope. The destroyed T-34 remained in place, its position partially blocking the narrow approach. Smoke from the impact drifted slowly through the debris-filled air, reducing visibility, but also concealing the German tank's exact location. No immediate Soviet movement was visible, but the absence of contact did not indicate safety. Soviet armored tactics increasingly emphasized follow on elements advancing behind lead vehicles, exploiting any breakthrough or weakness. Within minutes, the sound of distant engines confirmed that additional Soviet armor was operating nearby. The commander faced a new decision. Remaining in position preserved cover, but left the tank dependent on a compromised weapon system. Relocating risked exposure during movement, but might allow engagement at longer range, where the crew would have more time to compensate for the firing delay. German defensive doctrine emphasized the importance of repositioning after contact to avoid artillery or coordinated counterfire. The commander chose to move. The Panzer IV backed out slowly, using side streets and collapsed structures to mask its movement. Progress was deliberate. The driver avoided sudden turns or high speed, mindful that the track assembly might not tolerate aggressive maneuvering. After the earlier collision, the commander directed the tank toward a shallow depression overlooking the road junction the unit had originally been assigned to defend. From this position, visibility extended to several hundred meters, restoring the distance advantage that had been lost during the close engagement. At this range, the main gun's limitations became manageable. Even with the need to prepare the manual firing mechanism, the crew would have several seconds to align, load, and fire before an approaching Soviet vehicle reached effective return range. The commander's earlier decision to close the distance had been driven by necessity. Now distance once again became protection. The next Soviet probe appeared approximately 20 minutes later. Two T-34s advanced cautiously along the road, maintaining separation and using the wreck of the earlier vehicle as partial cover. Their approach suggested uncertainty rather than confidence. The sudden loss of the lead tank at close range had disrupted the momentum of the advance, forcing Soviet commanders to reassess the strength and position of German defenses in the area. The German crew prepared carefully. The loader pre-positioned ammunition. The gunner aligned the sight and rehearsed the manual firing sequence. When the lead T-34 moved into open ground at roughly 400 meters, the commander gave the order. The manual trigger was engaged without delay, and the Panzer's first shot struck the Soviet vehicle's hull side as it attempted to turn. The second T-34 immediately reversed, withdrawing behind cover. The engagement ended quickly, not because the German tank possessed superior firepower, but because distance had restored the time needed to compensate for its mechanical limitations. This pattern would repeat throughout the following hours. Soviet forces continued to probe the junction, advancing cautiously, firing intermittently, and withdrawing when met with accurate return fire. The German tank remained in position, relocating slightly between engagements to avoid artillery targeting. The electrical firing circuit never recovered fully, but the manual backup proved reliable enough when the crew anticipated its use. What had been a critical vulnerability at 30 meters became a manageable limitation at 300. By nightfall, the Soviet advance in the immediate sector had stalled. The German defensive line remained intact, though weakened and under constant pressure. Maintenance teams finally reached the Panzer IV after dark. Inspection confirmed that the electrical failure had been caused by shock damage to the firing contacts during earlier movement, likely worsened by vibration and the collision with the T-34. Temporary repairs restored partial function, but the system remained unreliable. The tank would require full workshop service to return to normal operating condition. For the crew, the events of the afternoon reinforced a lesson already familiar to experienced armored units. Mechanical reliability could not be assumed, and survival often depended on adapting tactics to the current condition of the vehicle, rather than to its intended performance. The commander's decision to close the distance earlier in the day was discussed within the unit, not as an act of aggression, but as an example of improvisation under equipment failure. At 30 meters, with no immediate way to fire, maneuver had become the only remaining weapon. From a broader operational perspective, such encounters were becoming increasingly common on the Eastern Front. The density of forces, the destruction of infrastructure, and the shift toward defensive fighting created conditions where armored engagements occurred at unpredictable distances and often without preparation. Theoretical advantages or gun penetration mattered less than crew coordination, situational awareness, and the ability to react when equipment failed. Soviet doctrine, for its part, emphasized persistence and numerical pressure. Losses at the individual vehicle level were expected. What mattered was maintaining momentum. In this case, however, the unexpected destruction of a lead tank at extremely close range had produced caution rather than acceleration. The psychological effect of sudden loss in confined terrain could disrupt tempo as effectively as physical obstacles. German armored units increasingly relied on such disruptions to compensate for declining numbers. By 1943, the Wehrmacht no longer possessed the operational freedom to conduct large-scale armored maneuvers across open terrain. Instead, individual tanks and small groups were used to anchor defensive positions, delay advances, and create uncertainty about the strength of German forces in a given sector. The survival of a single Panzer IV at a critical road junction could influence Soviet movement far beyond its actual combat power. In post-action reports, the commander did not emphasize the collision or the close-range engagement as extraordinary. He described the gun failure, the decision to advance to avoid being fired upon while stationary, and the subsequent restoration of defensive position at longer range. The tone was technical rather than dramatic. Within armored units, such decisions were understood as routine responses to abnormal conditions rather than exceptional acts. From a historical standpoint, the engagement illustrates the practical limits of armored warfare theory. Tanks were designed around specific performance assumptions: operational guns, intact optics, reliable mobility. When any of those elements failed, doctrine provided only general guidance. Commanders and crews had to rely on judgment, experience, and a clear understanding of their immediate environment. At 30 meters, the German tank had briefly lost its primary advantage. The decision to close the distance was not intended to destroy the enemy through impact or aggression. It was intended to deny the opposing crew the time needed to exploit the malfunction. In effect, the commander replaced firepower with disruption. That substitution, measured in seconds, allowed the crew to restore their weapon and regain control of the engagement. The broader lesson of the incident lies not in the outcome, but in the conditions that produced it. The Eastern Front in 1943 was a battlefield of worn machines, exhausted crews, and continuous pressure. Mechanical failure was not an exception, it was an expected risk. Survival depended on the ability to recognize when equipment limitations required immediate tactical adjustment. In later phases of the war, as German armored forces faced increasing numerical and material disadvantage, such improvisation became even more critical. Individual engagements could no longer be assumed to favor superior equipment or training. Instead, outcomes were shaped by small decisions made under mechanical uncertainty and time pressure. The moment at 30 meters, when the main gun failed and the commander chose to drive forward instead of retreat, reflects that reality. It was not a demonstration of confidence in the tank's strength. It was an acknowledgement of its sudden weakness and a decision to act before the enemy could exploit it. In armored warfare, as in all forms of combat, the decisive factor was often not the weapon itself, but what the crew did when the weapon failed.